we've actually gone backwards. We've actually lost our sense of strategic autonomy and independence compared to 100 plus years ago. We have no way of shooting down missiles coming into Australia, even just to protect our airfields and our naval bases and our critical infrastructure, let alone protecting our population. We have no interceptors. And look at what Reagan was able to achieve by being optimistic and positive and rallying the American middle class to believe that they had a future again. And America so rallied itself, of course, that they broke the Soviet Union effectively through the optimism that they were able to project. Had it not been for Churchill rallying in those darkest hour days of 1940, the world would today be very, very different.
I'm talking now with Mike Pezzullo, a former Secretary of the Home Affairs Department in Canberra from 2017 until 2023. I have heard Mike speak on numerous occasions and see him as a very clear, a very honest, and a very forthright public servant who is deeply committed to Australia's security and well-being. He's had some alarming things to say lately, which should be receiving even more attention than they are. For example, recently he wrote, "Real and present danger. China's deployment of a naval task group to our waters was a rehearsal that we should not dismiss lightly." Mike, thanks so much for giving us your time.
Hello, John.
Can I begin by asking you, you're a historian by training, as I understand it, and any number of wise men and women down through the ages have said, if you want to understand the future, you need to look to the past. You and I think, would see ourselves as deeply committed to our country, and yet there's a great mystery to me that independent, resilient, larrikin Australians, as a young nation in the very early days of our country, after we federated, we were ready for the First World War. It was astonishing, really. We celebrate Anzac Day and forget that we were able to secure our homeland because we had a powerful enough navy to keep Australia safe in a Pacific that was dominated actually by German warships. The Second World War, we were hopelessly unprepared. And I say that with some feeling because my own father was caught up in that mess. He was very badly wounded, left for dead in the Middle East. We were under-equipped, we weren't ready, we were sending young men up in aeroplanes that weren't safe, pretending they could take on the world's best fighters because we believed in industry policy, we wanted to make them here. You could argue we were ready for the Cold War, we were pulling our weight internationally. Now, we've known for at least 15 years since the Rudd government that the strategic environment is changing dramatically and for the worse. We now have leaders everywhere saying they're the most dangerous time since the 1930s, and yet we seem absolutely indolent, frankly, from the top down, as though it doesn't matter. And you made the comment very recently that we can choose social benefits or a country in the current circumstances. How have we become so disengaged from reality in our own self-interest, Mike?
Well, John, I think your starting point is the correct one. You've got to dig into a national history. You've got to understand contemporary culture and contemporary mores. You've really got to unpack where the national culture has come from. So let me reflect on the periods that you just mentioned in your question. I think before the First World War, and it's little appreciated just how important Australian naval and sea power was in the lead up to the First World War. And full credit to Deakin, particularly, who was passionate about establishing the Royal Australian Navy as an independent fighting force that was not reliant on the Royal Navy on the other side of the world. It's often forgotten that the first strategic action that we actually fought in the First War was not Gallipoli, which obviously in our national legend and mythology is very important, and it should be, but was actually the operation to clear out the Imperial German force in Rabaul in Papua New Guinea, what is today Papua New Guinea. And the Australians mounted an amphibious operation, led in fact by the Navy, fighting as ground infantry with some army in support, to clear out an Imperial German radio and coaling station. Why was that important? The Germans had a squadron that was based in what was then German-occupied or the German colonies of China, and they could have raided across the Pacific and cut off our important supply lines, but also our ability to support Britain with produce, with wool, with commodities, but also to send our troops over. I would take the starting point for Australian strategic independent thinking as actually Alfred Deakin and his quest to establish sea power, and then the execution or the, if you like, the implementation of that vision in that first campaign in September of 1914. I think also, John, it has to be said that as a monoculture, largely an Anglo-Australian culture, yes, there were others. There was some Italians, there was some Chinese, but it was largely, as I think everyone would agree, a monoculture with very deep ties of loyalty to Britain, to empire, to the Crown, etc. I think mobilising Australia to go effectively, other than that campaign in New Guinea, to the other side of the world to fight on the Western Front after Gallipoli, I think was a relatively straightforward cultural exercise. People might not have liked the fact that they were sending their young men typically off to war, but they accepted that it was the duty. Then, of course, the First World War was a scarifying experience, followed, of course, very closely by the Spanish flu. I think what you saw through the 20s and 30s, including in Australia with the rise of proto-fascist groups, the New Guard, but also the Bolsheviks, was a real questioning of the old established order. And Australia, to a lesser degree, but in countries like Britain and France, a very deep malaise, which then meant that as Mussolini first and then Hitler and then Tojo started to push their ambitions and to start to mobilise their forces for the conquest that they want to engage in, there was a deep malaise in the 30s. In fact, the scholars of modern France would suggest that the fall of France actually occurred in the 1930s with the falling away of national confidence, not wanting to go through another war, not wanting to stand up to Hitler. And so, of course, when the Blitzkrieg occurred in 1940, France fell. Britain would have, I suspect, fallen too, John, had it not been for Churchill's rallying efforts. Churchill these days, regrettably, in the way in which cultural history is taught and the academia being captured as it has been by hard leftist researchers, Churchill is, of course, condemned. He should be elevated as one of the great civilisational heroes who actually mobilised Britain and its Commonwealth or its imperial partners at a time when France had fallen, the Soviets were on Germany's side, and America was out of the fight. Had it not been for Churchill rallying in those darkest hour days of 1940, the world would today be very, very different. Of course, we then fought the Second World War. We don't need to rehearse that. I think you're right. I think the cultural readiness in the 50s and 60s was greater. I think people had learnt their lesson from the 20s and 30s and realised that if you drop your guard against dictators, they will come at you. And so the resilience after two world wars to stand up to Stalin, I think, was there. And you saw that here in our willingness to go to Korea, our willingness to go to Vietnam. But then, of course, there was another countercultural cycle in the late 60s with a questioning of the alliance and a questioning of the old order again, which led to the malaise that the West experienced in the late 60s and through the 70s. And then, of course, you had the Reagan Revolution staring down the Soviet Union and the rest of it. So that's as quick a thumbnail sketch of sort of history to, I guess, concurring with your overall assessment as I can do in the time available. Where are we now? I think now we are in a postmodern world where I think we've all been duped. We've duped ourselves, frankly, that we can isolate ourselves from these great geostrategic and geopolitical trends. We can live a largely autonomous and atomised life with a lot of material wealth and surrounding ourselves with material goods. And I think you see that in a whole range of indicators, like the breakdown in faith, the breakdown in community volunteering, the breakdown in some of the civic bonds that used to hold our societies together, except perhaps in some of the small regional towns that you and regional communities that you're so familiar with. But certainly in the cities, there's a sense of alienation, atomisation, living individualistically. I compare and contrast that cultural change here in Australia with the kind of cultural resilience that you find in places like Poland, in Ukraine, also in places like the Philippines, for instance. Why? Because they are facing adversaries across either very narrow waterways or across a land border. Australia does not have that existential sense of crisis or threat. We've got mercifully excellent relationships, an excellent relationship with our biggest neighbour, Indonesia, and by and large good relationships with other neighbours who are in any event much smaller than us. So I think as Blaney coined it in the 60s, the tyranny of distance, which originally affected our ability to trade, it built costs into our trade and into our relationships with the world, also created, I think, by the 60s and 70s, a false sense of comfort that distance was protecting us from geostrategic events. That, of course, held us in pretty good stead until probably Putin's ascendancy and the change that occurred in communist China just after 9/11, when two autocracies or tyrannies or in one case potentially a totalitarian regime really started to think that the world order was not to their liking and they had to change it, or they were going to change it, but with tools and weapons and systems that people like Hitler and Tojo and Mussolini could only have dreamt of. Distance has now disappeared. The adversary is sort of in front of us, but we've still got that sense of the protective effect of distance. Sorry, John, that's a huge topic, and I've tried to distill as much of an answer as I can in just a few minutes.
It's absolutely brilliant, and listeners will be captivated by it because it's so important, in my view. And to seek your response, to summarise, though, what strikes me is that a little country, putative, 5.5 million, very knew that distance didn't keep us safe, knew that alliances with the most powerful nation on earth at the time, Britain, wasn't enough, and acted accordingly. Here we are, 27 million people, infinitely wealthier, infinitely better off, infinitely more connected with the world, apparently thinking that distance will save us, that isolation means we can get on with our own lives, we can do butter, we don't have to worry about guns, despite all the warnings. That is extraordinary, really.
Yeah. In fact, John, I'd go further. I think there's been a devolution or a degeneration of Australia's strategic sensibility over about that 100-year arc. I would argue, notwithstanding the elitist view that somehow we weren't independent thinking, we were beholden to either the British Empire or the American Great Protector until people like Gough Whitlam came along and changed Australian foreign policy. I would argue that that's all mythical. The first Australian trade and foreign policy mission into Asia was led under the Lyons government by Latham as the External Affairs Minister, who was seeking to open up both new relationships and markets in places like China and Japan in the 1930s. Prior to that, and Lyons was treading carefully because he didn't want to be seen as being disloyal to empire, but he also had a sense that Britain was a long way away. In the 1937 election campaign, John Curtin, a lifelong socialist, anti-conscriptionist, argued passionately in the 37 campaign for Australia to rearm for local defence. And of course, he was castigated as being disloyal to empire. So the thought that somehow we were Ottomans who just simply followed an imperial line until people like Gough Whitlam came along in the early 70s and sort of modernised us is a complete myth. And going back to something we touched on earlier, I think Australia had a greater strategic sensibility about its own region, actually at the time of Federation. In fact, it was one of the big drivers for Federation. And you see it in Henry Parkes's Tenterfield speech, for instance. The defence of Australia was actually one of the big drivers that Parkes used to bludgeon some of the more reluctant colonies into line around Federation. I think compared to that time, to support your thesis, we've actually gone backwards. We've actually lost our sense of strategic autonomy and independence compared to 100 plus years ago.
Interesting that you should say that, because it is my view that the first responsibility of the Commonwealth Government, and I served in it for many years, as indeed you did in different roles, the first is to keep us safe, is to keep us secure. As you put it so succinctly, you know, you can have benefits or you can have security. Sometimes you have to make a choice. Now, I just want to dwell on history just for a moment before we come to the way it's now being ripped up at every level, on everywhere you look. And it's to go back to the fact that this perception that people are not willing to stand up for their freedoms and their values is not new. If you go back to the so-called Oxford Pledge of 1933, overwhelmingly the Oxford Union approved a motion that under no circumstances would this House fight for and die for king and country. That was seen as young Britain saying, and you mentioned it, the scarifying experiences of the First World War and the turmoil of the 20s into the Depression by then. They'd lost faith in many ways in their culture, in their leadership and what have you. That reverberated around the world. People believed that it encouraged Hitler in his assertiveness. The West doesn't believe in itself. Echoes of today. But, and you touched on it, those very same young Britons, just a few years later, under the strong and decisive leadership of Churchill, like all human beings, he was flawed, but our young people are taught that he was some sort of ogre, without understanding they wouldn't be there enjoying their high living standards and mobile phones if he hadn't been there. He so inspired young people as to fight in the skies over Britain and face death in their Spitfires and Hurricanes, to man the convoy escorts bringing food in from the US, all of those, and the colonies, the rest of the empire, all of those sorts of things. This is very important stuff to understand, because after that Oxford Pledge, he said, if you don't pass on to the next generation the story of your culture, and he said its religion and its heroes, they won't have a sense of place and a sense of purpose and an awareness of what are doing, what's needed. They're open to Marx's dictum that people who don't know their history are easily persuaded. We don't talk our heroes anymore. We denigrate our heroes. And in not acknowledging that we've had heroes, we're also encouraging people to think there aren't dangerous times. We demean ourselves, but we also place ourselves in danger, I would argue, by being so dishonest about dangerous times and the heroes who helped wind back those dangers.
Look, and you could actually run the same argument. Fast forward several decades, the same malaise, the same self-critique started to emerge in the 1960s when radical theorists started to, if you like, the origins of today's critique of the West started to emerge in the 60s, with post-modernist Marxists saying that Western societies are cleaved by racism, patriarchy, a systemic oppression of the poor, etc. And you saw the Black Panthers and others start to emerge. You then saw all of the calamity of the late 60s. You saw the civil disobediences, the riots. You saw the denouement of Nixon's administration with massive protests. And then you saw, of course, the malaise under Ford and Carter. What then happens? Reagan comes along and says, no, we don't have to make these choices. We can change the direction of our country. We can go for optimism. We can rely both on our strengths and, of course, acknowledge that things that have been done in the past aren't always perfect, but we can rally a country. And look at what Reagan was able to achieve by being optimistic and positive and rallying the American middle class to believe that they had a future again. And America so rallied itself, of course, that they broke the Soviet Union effectively through the optimism that they were able to project. And the Soviets came to realise we cannot match what America can generate in terms of economic prosperity, technological advancement, and in terms of military prowess. Now, of course, they then got their response completely wrong by thinking that under Gorbachev, you could have modest reforms that, if you like, tinkered around the edges of the Soviet model to then be able to compete against the Americans. Failed. Soviet Union dissolved. One of the great historical mysteries, I think, in hundreds of years' time, if we're still around, will be how did that all come to pass so peacefully without a nuclear weapon being fired? It was a remarkable end to what was a very tense period. And again, it was leadership. It was Reagan coming along and partnering with people like Thatcher, Helmut Kohl and others to say, no, we can change the destiny of our societies, and we'll need to take some risk. It will involve confronting the Soviets. I think, John, we're possibly in that in that cycle again. So rather than sort of a terminal structural decline of the West, it seems to me Spengler was right. It's sort of more cyclical. And unfortunately, we're sort of in a downswing at the moment where lack of national confidence, self-criticism, censorship, assuming that our societies are somehow structurally and systemically riven by racism, patriarchy, and so on and so forth. I think we're in that sort of lull period again. Now, who knows which hero will come along or which leader will come along to inspire us with optimism and with faith in the fundamental truth of the institutions that we've created over time, and the fact that people living freely are always going to generate better outcomes than people living under tyranny. So I think we're in a lull. The problem on this occasion, and I contrasted this and I touched on this earlier, the last time the West was in a lull and was confronted with very aggressive, territorially expanding powers like Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan, they just simply didn't have the weapons or the means to achieve their ends in quick enough order before they were smashed by American industrial and military prowess. Now you've got China, which for the first time is a tyrannical regime, an autocratic regime, but with more than just simply the outward appearance of capitalism. It's actually got very good innovation. It's got very deep capital pools. It's got deep capabilities, especially in manufacturing, because its predatory policies have allowed it to hoard manufacturing. We've never faced a situation like this. So whilst we're going through these cycles of confidence, malaise, and then redemption, and then optimism, and then growth, for about 500 years, there's always been a Western force that ultimately has led us all back to the peak. On this occasion, in the form of communist China, which has got deep flaws, deep structural problems, population, demographic issues, that is, structural problems in its economy, they are still a force to be reckoned with that we've never really had to confront.
Well, I agree, and I have many, many Chinese friends, and I take the view that there are not some sort of race-based differences between those who love freedom and those who don't. We're talking regimes here. We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party. We ought to be humble enough to recognise that communism is a bastard offshoot of the European Enlightenment, actually. Yes. And it's visited utter misery everywhere it's touched on people's lives. We should never forget that. It's the great thing that the left, where they still champion many of these values on our university campuses, will not come to grips with. It's not blessed people with human flourishing wherever it's gone. But now, in the context of everything you've said, we suddenly discover in Australia that we are surprisingly alone, for all the reasons you've just outlined, plus the unpredictability, it has to be said, that we're now witnessing in Washington. And you have written extensively about it. Can I ask you, why did the Chinese Communist Party deploy a very powerful naval force into our region, further away from home than they have ever gone before? And what was it about?
Well, putting such a powerful task group into the Tasman Sea, there's no real military logic to that, because it's not in the way. You have to go a long way out of your way to drive your ships into the Tasman Sea. It strikes me, and I've written about this, that it had a dual and mutually reinforcing objective. One was to strategically intimidate us, which is to say, look, relations at the moment have been stabilised and we've relented on some of our trade measures in relation to wine and lobster and barley and beef. But if you don't toe the line as we would expect, we can do other things to you. Apart from trade coercion, we can actually dominate your near seas, and we can do it in a way that you could do nothing about except for the protection that you think you might have through your alliance with the Americans. So that was the diplomatic and strategic purpose. Mutually reinforcing that objective was the twin objective that reinforces the first one, which is to conduct a military rehearsal. The specific ship that they chose is the most powerful surface combatant in the world, and short of an aircraft carrier that could launch carrier-borne aircraft raids, as the Japanese did in 1942, It's the most powerful warship that they could put into our waters or our near waters. A cruiser, which for your viewers, cruisers are larger than destroyers. They are, if you like, the capital ship of choice, short of aircraft carriers, to undertake long-range missions where the warship needs a degree of autonomy. In other words, it can protect itself against submarines, it can protect itself against air attack, and it's designed to then carry out strike missions using the Chinese equivalent of a Tomahawk cruise missile. Most of us would have heard about Tomahawks. The Chinese have got an equivalent version known as the CJ-10 Longsword. They would have been rehearsing their missile crews inside that hull, because they wouldn't have slackened off and just gone to the gym and had early happy hours every afternoon. They would have been working tirelessly to ensure that the missiles in their tubes were ready to fire. They'd run diagnostics to say, right, we're now sailing opposite Amberley Air Base or opposite Williamtown Fighter Base in Newcastle or off Fleet Base East in Sydney. And the captain would have been issuing orders to undertake no-notice targeting of those locations. And they would have run drills without actually firing the weapon, obviously. And how do we know this, John? Because that's what we do. That's what any Navy does. You work your crews hard, you rehearse their main mission. In support of that cruiser was an escorting destroyer to help protect it in case there was a submarine or air attack nearby. It probably had a submarine in close company. We don't know that. The CDF was equivocal about that when he was asked about that in the Senate committee. And it had, incredibly importantly, a replenishment tanker. In other words, it had its own petrol station in escort, so it could go the distance and probably top up some of its supplies. Now, in wartime, that mission would probably be a larger protected group, probably a couple of extra destroyers, certainly a submarine to protect it. And it would have simply sat off the Australian coast and been able to hold any of those targets at risk, be it an air base, a naval base, sensitive communications facilities, dams, power stations. And we would have been able to do very little about it unless we could put our submarines in the water, and that's an open question, particularly in terms of recent reporting about the unavailability potentially of the Collins class. And it would have actually been very hard to strike it with the weapons that we currently have. This is deeply concerning. It leaves us as vulnerable potentially as Australia was back in Deacon's day, but Deakin at least had the foresight, the fortitude, as we talked about earlier, to commission the HMAS Australia, which was a battle cruiser, which was able to, in effect, terrify the Germans out of our waters. I don't think we've got the courage to do that now.
Well, that's a particularly concerning issue. Let's just go back to what we were talking about earlier. 2009, when Rudd was Prime Minister Rudd, and he understood, by the way, he understood Chinese communism. Essentially, he and his government resolved then, and we're talking 2025, and none of this has happened, we should secure 12 new state-of-the-art submarines and Tomahawk missiles.
Yes.
And 16 years on, we've done no such thing. We talk about AUKUS, but now's the danger time, as everyone says. You yourself have referred again to the intelligence that says President Xi wants to be able to move on Taiwan by 2027 militarily if they have to. As we speak, Australia's defence capabilities are declining, as I understand it, and because of the AUKUS submarines, $82 or $83 billion has been rescoped, to use the jargon, out of our capacity now, which, as I say, is declining. That's partly why it's declining, to help pay for that, which may be too late. Isn't that an astonishingly powerful condemnation of our, let's be blunt, our political, our military, our strategic leaders in this country?
Well, John, by way of disclosure, because not all of your viewers will know this, I led the white paper team in 2009 that developed the options for Mr Rudd and his government to consider. So I had the honour of as a Deputy Secretary of Defence leading that team. It was not my individual genius or foresight. I had a wonderful team in support, and we analysed very carefully intelligence, we analysed strategic assessments, we analysed things that just at the time, John, did not make sense. Why was it? Why? And this is 3 years before President Xi was elected as the incoming General Secretary and President of China. So we're talking about 2008, 2009, so during the time of Hu Jintao. It was very clear to us that they were developing weapon systems to target things like US carrier battle groups, to target land bases such as Guam, and indeed land bases such as Darwin, to the extent that Darwin might be made available to the Americans in any future Pacific war. It struck us that, and this is before Xi came on the scene, it struck us that structurally, leaving aside personality, structurally, the Chinese Communist Party wanted to assure itself or give itself the option of being able to counter American conventional firepower to the extent that the Americans would come to the view that they would take such losses that even if the Chinese took heavy losses, that they would have to then rely on nuclear weapons sooner rather than later. And that would give the Chinese leadership to, in effect, deter the Americans from taking conventional action on the fear that nuclear escalation could occur. Now, there was one problem with that theory, was that against a Reaganite-type president who was willing to take it to the brink, a first nuclear strike against China would potentially wipe out what was at that time a minuscule nuclear force. Guess what they've done in the last 16 years? They have gone hell for leather to improve their nuclear weaponry, their nuclear capability, their dispersal of their weapons, and also the hardening of their bunkers and their command and control systems. They no longer have that fear that they would lose a relatively small nuclear force to a US first strike. So they've got an assured second strike capability, which takes that fear away. They've created the world's largest navy. In platform terms, they're now bigger than the US Navy, who of course have stretched across more global theatres of responsibility. So that master plan that we started to discern, not through any prescience, but just simply thinking through, as a strategist would think through, how the Chinese evolved their capabilities, really struck us with great clarity in that period, 2008, 2009. Mr. Rudd, to his credit, and I think it's been well enough written about, although I won't disclose matters that, and you wouldn't want me to disclose cabinet confidences where I witnessed certain discussions, but I think it's fair to say, just from memoirs and Mr. Rudd's own memoir, that he led that debate within his government pretty much on his own, that there wasn't a lot of support for the kind of rearmament that he had in mind. And tragically, and I say this without any political partisanship at all, once he was removed from the leadership through the change of leadership to Ms. Gillard, all of those plans fell away. Now, people can come to their own judgments about who's culpable in all of that. Had that plan been continued, what I'll call the 2009 plan, and the government hadn't made a final decision at that point, John, but we probably would have gone, because we own the IP for the Collins, we would have gone for probably a stretched, evolved Collins, which was a pretty safe design because we'd already built the Collins 1, so we could evolve it. Effectively, that's the Kim Beazley proposal that Kim's promoted for many, many years. That would have then allowed us to bridge the period that we're in now into a nuclear capability, but with a fleet by now that would have been 8, 10, 12 strong. Now we've got 6 of the old Collins that were old even then, without any high level of confidence that we can put enough out to sea. The other thing that defence force had contained in it wasn't just simply Tomahawks, but also a pathway to ballistic missile defence. That's been cut out as well. Now, fast forward to the defence force that we have. Yes, we're spending just around 2%. A lot of that 2%, though, and you've touched on this, is not the 2% that Mr. Morrison left when he left office in 22. That's been hollowed out to pay for, and I'm a supporter of Virginias. If we ever get Virginias in any sort of reasonable time this century, they'll be a stupendously capable a weapon of war, particularly when we move to what's called the Virginia Block 7, and we can talk about the different blocks in a moment if you wish. The problem is when the deal was done internally within the government, the Albanese Labor government, to then reprioritise a whole lot of programs to pay for that, even though it looks like defence spending has been slightly increased, 2% going up to 2.4, albeit over a decade, a lot of that has been, a lot of the weapon systems have been hollowed out to pay for the submarines. So where does that now leave us? And I touched on this in my column that you've referred to several times. We've either just about or have paid off our last minesweeper. They're called mine countermeasures vessels. If a port was mined, say Newcastle Port or Sydney Harbour or one of the great ports, Gladstone, where we're so reliant on shipping coming in and going out, and we are a trading nation, as you well know, you could mine any one of those ports. We would have no safe way to demine that port.
Staggering.
We'd literally have to go to our American friends or potentially rely on the British or the French to come down and demine our own ports. Alfred Deakin would be rolling in his grave. And why was that done, John? The mine countermeasures capability, which Mr. Rudd's white paper provided for back all the way back in 2009, has been defunded to make fiscal room for the submarine. So in other words, there's a fiscal cap that's effectively being put in place at about 2% of GDP going out slowly. But then as the submarine capability comes in and has to be paid for, other things get displaced, just like, water is displaced when a submarine goes through the water. The other thing that we've knocked out of provisioning, we've delayed yet again the purchase of the Tomahawks. Mr. Rudd's cabinet signed off on the purchase of the Tomahawks in 2009. We still don't have any. And the third thing that I draw to your attention and to that of your viewers is ballistic missile defence. We see how critical ballistic missile defence is in Ukraine, in Israel and elsewhere. We have no way of shooting down missiles coming into Australia, even just to protect our airfields and our naval bases and our critical infrastructure, let alone protecting our population, because we've defunded the interceptors that would be fired off into either the space to take out missiles in their mid-course, or that would deal with missiles that were coming in what's called the terminal phase as they're screaming through the atmosphere. We have no interceptors. And so again, as with the mine warfare capability, we'd have to go to the Americans and say, look, we're not self-reliant, we're not independent, and we're not autonomous when it comes to shooting down missiles. Can you help us? Again, Alfred Deakin would, as would John Curtin, they would roll in their graves.
Well, yes. And by the way, just on those missiles, 2 points. One is, how many years is it now since we were promised that we'd be building them here within 2 years? Many years on, I understand we haven't even selected a site on which to build them. And the second point is, we're a trading nation. We don't have our oil reserves and other reserves in place. We're totally dependent upon shipping. Even in the absence of a war, surely part of the message from China is don't get involved or we can have a go at you. We do not possess a single flagged Australian trading international vessel. Not one, not a tanker, not a bulk carrier, nothing. Thanks in many ways to the unions, it has to be said. We don't possess one. We had 12 or 15 only a couple of years ago, none. So the first thing governments do if something goes wrong is requisition the necessary ships to back up your naval capacity and your trade capacity, keep your country going. We've got no ships to requisition.
That's right. That's right.
A trading nation like ours, utterly dependent on keeping our sea lanes going. We haven't even stockpiled enough here to keep our economy going for more than a couple of weeks in terms of fuel reserves. As a farmer, I don't know what sort of access we would have to the fertilisers and some of the key ingredients that we no longer produce here if something went wrong, for something as basic as feeding ourselves. I don't want to sound alarmist, but who is grappling with this stuff now that is actually in a...
Candidly, John, no one. Candidly, we've talked about a few historical periods. The last time we seriously developed what was called in the 50s, rather ominously, the War Book, which laid out things like stockpiling policies, rationing policies, and so on and so forth. There was a version of the War Book that carried through. I know this for a certain fact because I was a young graduate in the Defence Department, and we used to get access to it. that program was shut down. In other words, the emergency management world, quite rightly, has been very focused on bushfire, flood, cyclone, as it should be. But in the 50s, 60s and 70s, the emergency management world, which was typically in part staffed by retired military, also had a civil defence function. You'd be hard pressed, and I don't want to go too much into the confidences that I still am obligated to keep, but you'd be hard pressed if you were to press into the emergency management area of government, which is in my old Department of Home Affairs, to even get an acknowledgement. They wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't want it tabled in Parliament, but you wouldn't even get an acknowledgement that such a plan exists. You know why? Because I suspect it doesn't. And that, and that to me is deeply worrying. The fact that a war book doesn't even exist. Now, you might not publish it, and you'd have good reasons to say to the Senate and or the House of Representatives that we're claiming a Crown immunity over it. But I don't even know that we could, hand on heart, say that the thing exists. And that is, in this world, terrifying. Because to take one example that you just mentioned of shipping, even short of a war, we're seeing strange sabotage occurring right around the world, including of shipping. There was just a case in the English Channel just the other day. Undersea infrastructure, undersea pipelines. We've got very little recognition or knowledge of what's happening in the undersea domain. And increasingly these days, you don't need a big submarine to sabotage a pipeline. There are long-range autonomous underwater vehicles that are very stealthy, very hard to detect. And the undersea domain is becoming more like the air domain, very congested, very contested, and very crowded. We've got nothing down there. It's terrifying, John.
Can I ask how many people there are in the Department of Defence in Canberra?
The department, I don't know, to be honest. The ADF itself is 57,000. The department would be somewhere north of 30,000, but I couldn't, hand on heart, say that I know what the full-time equivalent workforce is, John. I'll have to take that on.
Yeah, that's all right. It just strikes me that everyone knows what a mess we make of acquisitions. Then you hear things like, we haven't updated the war book for years. That's my comment, not yours. And we don't even know whether one exists. And there are many aspects to security. It's not just simply defence hardware. There's the number of troops and actual ADF. I mean, at 57,000, that's very modest across three services. 14,000 only in the Navy. They are apparently so lacking personnel that they're decommissioning rather than manning more ships. I think this is astounding stuff, and we could talk on it forever. You mentioned something that would be interesting. You referred to, and I'm obviously a great supporter of the Virginias as well. My late father-in-law was a rear admiral, and he was arguing to me from about 2009 on vigorously that if approached in the right way, the Americans would do Virginias with us. He believed that passionately. So I've long recognised the potential there. But you mentioned Block 7 upgrading, presumably, as they evolve. And go back to something you said earlier, the Chinese now have more warships, surface ships, than the Americans. Not tonnage. I suspect the American technology may still also be in favour, particularly if you combine it with the Japanese. Large number of very capable warships now, which we don't talk about much. And the Japanese, of course, they have real incentive to make sure that they're able to trade as an independent nation going forward. But I take it you're alluding to our underwater capability, and it's advancing still further. Submarines are still relevant. Might be the neat way to summarise the issue.
Yes, the Virginias have been evolving in this direction, and Block 7 will have a larger module built into it. They've got a large canvas module that is able, that increasingly, they're doing it with their Block 5s and 6s, but the 7s will be even more capable. They'll be able to deploy long-range sensor systems, surveillance systems, the sort of the underwater drones that I referred to earlier, but also drones like mini submarines that could conduct lethal missions with torpedoes or mines and then return back to and dock back into the Virginia. They can also deploy very significant underwater special forces. Of course, the Navy SEALs. Everyone, I think, comprehends what the Navy SEALs can do, and they come in on submersible vehicles that can also be deployed stealthily by Virginias. So the traditional model that I think most people would have just from war movies of the submarine sitting there stalking its prey with the periscope up and just firing torpedoes at a ship. They still fire torpedoes, but increasingly they're becoming more like multifunctional platforms that can do all sorts of things, of which firing a torpedo in the classic World War II sense is just but one of the missions that they can undertake. They also will have vertical launch tubes to be able to more efficiently launch things like Tomahawk. They'll be immensely capable. The problem, John, with the Virginias is that the Americans are short of them. And so really AUKUS Track 1, we can cut as many checks as we want. We can put down payments on what we really need to do with our American friends because we want at least 8. The American requirement is for at least 60. So our proportion of the fleet is not insignificant. It's 8 out of a total fleet, say, of 74. So it's over 10% of the fleet. I think there's a case to be made for Australia to say, look, whether we do it in America and we fly in our own workers so you can train them, or whether we have a maintenance yard at least down here, if not a construction yard, this has now got to become a joint enterprise, and we've got to lift the rate of production to both fill your needs and our needs. Because if they're currently tracking at 49 submarines, their naval requirement is north of 60, so they are 16 odd short of their own requirement before you get to our 8. So joint production, I think, makes a lot of sense. That'll be a huge national enterprise, which will require not just the Department of Defence, but national industry. It's a workforce issue. It's about having more welders and apprentices and all the rest of it. And if we get that right, I'm not so concerned about our underwater security in the 30s and 40s, but I'm desperately concerned about our underwater security in the near term because even for the Americans, those Block 7s won't arrive for some years yet. So we've got nothing. At least the Americans have got 49 submarines that they can deploy around the world, even if they're of an older class. We've got 6 Collins, and there's a question mark just in today's newspaper about the viability of the Collins life extension. I'm desperately concerned about our submarine capability gap, desperately concerned.
Well, all of this begs a really, really important question in my view, Mike. Plainly then, if we have, and we believe we have, the capability to fund, build, obtain, and man something as lethal as these Block 7 Virginias in the future, if we can recognise that it's very evident that Beijing really desperately doesn't want us to have them, that tells you that we shouldn't throw up our hands in despair and say we're helpless, because many people listening to this would probably say, oh, well, let's just go back to sleep and enjoy, eat, drink and be merry because we can't do anything about tomorrow. You're not accepting that position. I'm not accepting that position. And you've set out 10 reasons or 10 things we should do urgently now in the next 2 years. One wonders about the willpower again to get real, but keeping in mind that we're not despairing about the future. By definition, we're saying we can have those very powerful weaponry. The fact that they're effective is evidenced in the response to them out of Beijing. What should we do now? You set it out in your words. What should the priorities be for an incoming government? We're about to have an election that actually understands its first responsibility is to keep us safe.
Well, the first thing I would do is, and people say, well, where's the money coming from? You and I both know, John, how budgeting is done. This government has put 3 percentage points of GDP onto the size of government in 3 years. So you look at the work that people like Chris Richardson and others have done. You look at the national accounts. Off the back of the pandemic, the size of government in terms of the revenue that the Commonwealth collects and then disperses either through its own services and programs or that it disperses to the states and territories and to local government was about 25% of GDP. It is now in the last national accounts 28%. So every year in the last 3 years, we've added 1 percentage point, which is about $25 billion, to the size of government. So there are choices to be made. Now, people might argue the choices that have been made about aged care, childcare, roads, airports, infrastructure, NDIS are valid choices. Of course they are. But that's the point I made in the quote that you read out before. We can have those social benefits, but if you're then going to be coerced, suborned and subjugated through military attack, you lose those social benefits anyway because your overlord takes them off you. So funding 1 percentage point on defence should be eminently doable. It will involve reducing some of those other social programs. But John, it would only get us back to if, let's say, we allocated another 1% of GDP tomorrow out of that 28% of GDP that's currently allocated to government. Government would still be bigger than it was pre-pandemic. So in other words, there's a lot of fat based on the choices that we've been making about what we want to spend our money on. That's point one. Point two, people then say, but this, Mike, there's such a long lead time. Those Block 7s, for instance, aren't coming anytime soon. True. What you could do is to flesh out and bulk up your current hollow force. So you touched on it with the ADF being 57,000, 14,000 in the Air Force, about 14,000 in the Navy, about 28,000 in the Army. Let's just take one example. Tomorrow, we could double our maritime surveillance capability with our magnificent P8 Poseidons. You'll recall from your time in government, we transitioned from the old P3 Orions to very capable P8 Poseidons, excellent ASW anti-submarine warfare aircraft, maritime surveillance. They've also got a long-range anti-ship missile capability. They are built on a 737 airframe. Now, you're an ex-aviation and transport minister. As you all know, companies that buy a 737 try to keep it in the air as much as possible because that's how they make their money. We have to ground our P8s because of crew limitations. So in other words, the plane flies its long mission, it comes home, the crew is fatigued, you've got to rest the crew, the plane stays in the hangar. If you double tomorrow the pipeline of aircrew, and let's say you move to a crewing ratio of 2 or 2.1 per aircraft, what you would do is that P8 would land, you'd refuel it, put a new crew on it, get it back out over the water, do its surveillance, come back, the crew that had flown the previous mission would be rested up, they'd fly off again. Simple things like that. That's not buying more aircraft. That's getting more utilisation. That's getting more effectiveness and efficiency out of our current airframe. So we can do a lot of that based on our current force. Increase your crewing ratios. Open up your bare bases in the north. Stock up your munitions. Stock up your inventory. There are lots of things you can do that don't rely on waiting for weapon systems that arrive in the 2030s. Now, there are some things that you can't do. We can't magically conjure up a submarine to cover the capability gap between now and the mid-2030s. So what do we do there? Well, I think we should be exploring, as the Ukrainians have shown brilliantly, military innovations like long-range autonomous underwater drones, which might only have one mission. So unlike those Virginias that might be able to perform 10 missions, you might say, until we get those, I'm going to have a long-range drone, an underwater drone, and all it does is goes off to kill ships. And I accept that it's not going to be able to do any other missions, and I'm going to get 20 of those. There are Australian companies now building those kinds of underwater drones. They cannot get a look in at the Defence Department because they say, well, we don't need these drones because we're getting the Virginias or the AUKUS boat after the Virginias, but we don't need anything immediately. That long-termism, so sometimes people talk about short-termism, that long-termism in defence is a way to kick things down the road, whereas what we should be doing is saying, how do you maximise the lethality, the effectiveness, the utilisation of our current assets in the next 24 months while we wait for these more exquisite, more multifunctional capabilities to arrive in the 30s and 40s?
Lee Kuan Yew, the famous and pretty powerful leader of Singapore for so long, that's turned it into a country where per capita income now is way above Australia's, which is astonishing to me when you think it's only a 50 or 60-year-old country that was initially very poor. But he, in about 2002 or 3, commented that China was becoming so powerful that it would only have to flex its economic and diplomatic muscle to pull others into line. It wouldn't even need military power. Well, we see now they've got military power as well, massive military power. And he said the only answer to that would be for everyone else in the region to absolutely knuckle down, ruck down together and say an attack on one of us is an attack on all of us. That's not happening at the moment as I see it. There's the Quad, there's a certain amount of activity going on, but it's still not as coordinated as it might be. For example, I think we could do more to show solidarity with the Philippines. You will have done some thinking around this area of diplomacy and how we club together and how we send a united message.
I think, yes, I have, John. And I think the answer to that conundrum is to accept right up front and to acknowledge it right up front in our dealings in our region that countries in the region do not want to make a choice as they see it between China and the US. So they say, Australia's got this great trading relationship with China, it's got a military alliance with the Americans, and you're happy with that ambiguity. Well, we want to be in an even more ambiguous situation, unless you're the Philippines, because of that very direct, in-your-face confrontation that they're experiencing. I think Australia could actually take that to the bank and say, look, we've made our choice. We've got a military alliance with the Americans. We host facilities such as Pine Gap. We've got the Marines in Darwin. We do want to have a good relationship with the Chinese people, and we want to trade. But if push comes to shove, we want to harden ourselves and be hard to be able to resist, whether it's grey zone coercion, trade and economic coercion, sabotage, and ultimately, of course, military threat. We'd like to partner with you so that you don't have to make an existential choice between the Americans and the Chinese, but we want to partner with you so that if you do come under coercive pressure from the Chinese, we can help you in the way that we have managed these issues ourselves, the way in which we've resisted trade coercion. And in the case of the Philippines, we even want to help you with technical assistance, military training, cyber defence and the like. I think we've got so much opportunity to be going into the region with a very open approach, which acknowledges the fact that most countries do not want to make a binary choice between America and China, but they do want that safety net of support if they're going to be coerced by China. Now, what's stopping us from doing that, John? It's the lobster, the wine, the barley and the beef. We're so fixated now on having stabilised a relationship, which is a good thing in itself. Now we don't want to do anything to disrupt that. Well, in the meantime, the Chinese send naval task forces around us. They coerce us. They intimidate us in any way they want. I think we should take our trade and other relationships in the region, which goes back 100 years to when the Lyons government sent its first trade and diplomatic mission into Asia, and say, look, we're not asking you to sign a treaty with the Americans or indeed to align yourself with the Americans over the Chinese. But if you ever get in trouble, let's have the procedures, processes and capabilities in place now so that you can defend yourself against coercion. I think Australia would be welcomed with open arms.
I'm a farmer. I'm very interested in that trade. It matters. I get its significance, but I'm always mindful that it was Henry Kissinger who observed a little trade lost can always be recovered. Freedom lost is lost forever.
Indeed.
Mike, we could talk forever. It's really a question of willpower. It's a question of the Australian people recognising, I think, that we need, as a nation, to say we actually believe in ourselves. And we want to combine with others who believe in themselves. Take the Japanese, take the Philippines. I mean, there are plenty of people just looking for us to take a plucky lead and to join with them to say, this is enough. But it does require us making difficult choices. It does require us believing in ourselves enough for young men and women to want to join and stay with our defence forces rather than being discouraged. It does require us to make choices about expenditure. How do you feel? Can we do it?
Yes, we've done it before, and the tone is set from the top. As you all know, you've been a serving politician. I've never been a serving politician, but once you've got that mandate and you've got clarity of purpose, and whether it's Operation Sovereign Borders and stopping the boats, or in the time of your government where Mr Howard made a decision with the rest of your cabinet to introduce a goods and services tax, Keating and Hawke reforming the Australian economy. These things can be done. You've got to set the tone at the top. You've then got to have the personnel, both ministers and agency and departmental leaders, to execute the vision. You've got to motivate your workforce, whether it's a submarine workforce or your home affairs workforce, to develop new war book arrangements that we talked about. It's eminently doable. You've just got to take that very first step, and you've got to set the tone from the very top.
Well, I think that is very important. You've got to carve out a constituency, to use a word that my good friend Peter Costello often talks about, because there was no actual constituency when we started to try to pay down the annual deficit, or reduce the deficits, pay down the national debt. There was no constituency for tax reform. You had to go up there and lead from the top. That's what's required. As we come towards an election, my plea would be, please, those of you who aspire to top office, recognise that the world has changed dramatically in the last few years and is changing right before our eyes, and that even our friends, the Americans, are making it very plain that they expect us to show a little more confidence in ourselves and step up, and not to assume, not to presume, if I can put it that way.
John, I couldn't agree more, and there are lots of other examples. We've touched on Churchill rallying the British Empire. We've touched on Reagan. Locally in Australia, there was no constituency, to use that formula, for any of the economic reforms that Keating implemented under Hawke's leadership and his government. They had to create the constituency, and there was a political debate at the time. Both Mr. Howard and Mr. Peacock had debates with Hawke and Keating, but we got to a kind of a national landing on that. And Australia's better for having lower trade barriers, a more open economy, etc. Australia's better for having a goods and services value-added tax. Australia's better, although the benefit of having paid down that debt, unfortunately, has been rather lost because we've added so much debt since Mr. Costello's time. These things are all eminently doable. I remember when I was in the Rudd government, asked to transfer to the Customs Service, which at the time was grappling with the boats that were starting to arrive in 2009. The staff were demoralised. They didn't feel that they had the clear mandate to stop the boats with aggressive, both on-water operations as well as aggressive intelligence and policing operations in Indonesia. And as you well know, Mr. Abbott won a resounding victory on, and people dumb it down by saying, he just had a slogan, stop the boats. I can tell you, within the bureaucracy, and you know this from having led as a minister departments, having a very simple, even just 3-word mission allows people like me to go, right, we know what the government, they're democratically elected, we know what they want, we know how to deliver it for them, we know that there's political authority behind that. So Mr. Abbott and his ministers, Mr. Morrison as the then Immigration and Border Protection Minister, said, look, we're not the experts, you guys are the experts, but here's what we want you to achieve, and we want you to stop those boats. That's an incredibly powerful situation where you've got, and I don't to this day, because I was head of the Customs and Border Protection Service at the time, I don't know whether my staff voted Liberal or Labor or National, and I didn't care, because whatever our own political views were, we had a democratically elected government that had given us a mission, and they were trusting us to execute that mission because they trusted us as the experts who knew how to do on-water operations, intelligence operations and the like. It's been done many times before, John. It's a question of that initial step of authority, mandate, leadership, and then execution.
Well, I reckon the 3-word mantras should be secure our freedom, and a 4-word one, we believe in ourselves. Mike, thanks. And can I say to our listeners, stroke viewers, Mike does a lot of writing and his thoughts are, I think, profoundly insightful and important, and he's truly committed, I think, to the freedom and well-being of our country. So I do commend, Mike, your writings and your commentary. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks very much.